Joining us now on the Megacast is the Watershed Planner at the Huron River Watershed Council. Dan Brown joins us as we talk about contamination and other environmental issues in our local area. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Glad to have you on. So you're the watershed planner at the Huron River Watershed Council. Define that for us. What does a day in your life look like as you're working in our local waterways and helping to maintain the status of our environment?
Yeah, so we do a number of things at the Watershed Council. We coordinate volunteers. We are stewards of the river, so our mission is to protect the Huron River and the wildlife and people that are connected to it. So we have a number of programs that are associated with it. My role is talking a lot about PFAS, making sure that the state regulators are doing what they need to protect our river, protect our environment. I'm also involved in dam removal and other river restoration projects. But we have a lot of projects that sort of run the gamut on environmental protection, river restoration, stormwater management.
And we hear so much about PFAS and the ways that it impacts our local environment, certainly our waterways. But where does this come from? What sort of products, what sort of industries are we typically seeing that PFAS contamination come from?
Yeah, so the first thing to realize is that PFAS is a huge family of chemicals. It's the thousands of chemicals. I think the most recent number was in the tens of thousands of types of specific PFAS chemicals that are out there and used. In Michigan, I think it's around about 100, maybe 200 chemicals that are used more widely, but it's a huge number. And they come from lots of different things, and they're used in lots of different commercial industrial processes. Typically anything that is waterproofed or has a really smooth surface, or is used to put out fires or lubricate anything is typically going to have PFAS in it. But you'll find it in anything from firefighting foam used at airports, to your Teflon pans, to the siding in your house, to dental floss. So you really can find it anywhere. It's in some types of food, it's in some types of plants. So you can encounter it really, really wherever you look, because they are so pervasive and they've been used for so long.
And they not only have effects on our local waterways and on our environment, they can also have a number of health effects on humans as well. Can you speak of that and just how potentially dangerous that exposure can be to individuals like you and I?
Yeah. So the thing about PFAS is that they're toxic in just extraordinarily tiny doses. Really, what most of us, I think, would think of just like trace doses of this stuff is harmful when you're exposed to them over a period of time. But the exposure is more akin to smoking. So it's prolonged, repeated exposure that's really the concern, or really high doses that most of us would never encounter all at once. But yeah, you can run into those anywhere. It builds up over time. The other thing about PFAS is they never break down, so it can accumulate in your system, can accumulate in tissue over a long period of time. And that can disrupt really every bodily function that you can think of, and it's associated with a number of negative health impacts. Lots of cancers have been associated with PFAS, reproductive function, high cholesterol. There's some evidence coming out that it reduces fertility. So again, because the family of PFAS is so large, the number of health impacts is also quite large, and they are extremely toxic even in very low doses.
We're joined by Dan Brown, Watershed Planner at the Huron River Watershed Council, on today's edition of the Megacast, talking about PFAS contamination, the various ways it affects our waterways and can affect people like you and I as well. And are these easy to detect, or does it take a certain method of testing or equipment in order to detect PFAS contamination?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it is, because they are toxic in such low doses, we also need to sample, at incredibly fine resolution. So the tests have to be very sensitive to detecting these things. And so what you're really looking at is really specialized tests that are very sensitive. and a procedure around collecting the samples that often is also very sensitive and careful, because even if you use the wrong gloves or you're wearing the wrong makeup, or you, in some cases, breathe on it wrong, you might contaminate the sample with PFAS from you and not the source that you're sampling. So it does require just a tremendous amount of care and specialized tests to sample PFAS effectively. The good news is that more and more labs are getting better at it. So it used to be that the cost of PFAS testing and sampling was through the roof, and it's come down to where it's more in line with sampling other types of contamination that we might see, because it is everywhere and there's a lot of interest in sampling it. But it does require specialized sensitive tests.
And so we know that these are harmful to our waterways. We know that they're harmful in trace doses, so to speak, to humans. So then how do communities protect from PFAS contamination in their local area?
Yeah, so Ann Arbor is a good example of sort of what you can face through PFAS and through exposure. So if you're in a municipal area, you can rely on and ask your local officials about what's being done, what your concerns are. But the primary concern for most municipalities is of course drinking water. It's what we're going to be exposed to, what we're going to be ingesting over periods of time and getting exposed to potentially that PFAS. The good news is that the state of Michigan has sampled all public and municipal water supplies, and it's pretty rare that a water supply that is controlled publicly is out of compliance. And if they are out of compliance, then they're made to get back into compliance. And Ann Arbor is a good example where PFAS was discovered, and they took steps to filter PFAS out of their water at their drinking water intake, essentially by using the world's best, biggest, most powerful Brita filters. So there are steps that communities can do to reduce PFAS in drinking water supplies. It is extraordinarily expensive to do that, and it's far more effective to have the treatment take place at the source of contamination, which in most cases in Michigan is going to be an industrial polluter or some other entity like that. If we're talking about resident or rural areas with a lot of private wells, it gets a little bit trickier, because then there's more responsibility and more burden on the individual homeowners to make sure that their individual drinking water wells are safe. So that it's then the responsibility of the homeowner, unfortunately, to get a drinking water test and make sure that they're not ingesting PFAS through their water. And if you did detect PFAS, there are steps you can take to filter out PFAS or remediate your PFAS exposure in your home if you're on a private well.
And as you mentioned, in more rural areas or in areas where someone or a group of people may be on private wells, that is going to put them a little bit more at a risk, simply because the onus is then on them to protect from this contamination within that specific water source. So then just how greatly or how differently does PFAS contamination affect these more vulnerable communities than it does in other general areas that may have those protections in place from the municipal government or from other sources?
Yeah, and another great question. And we've seen this story play out with other types of contamination, but we're also seeing it play out with PFAS. So this is nothing new, unfortunately, that vulnerable communities are more exposed to PFAS in many cases because of the legacy industrial pollution that is often present in those communities, or because in places like rural areas there are often landfills or other dumping sites that were used nearby, and they're also on private wells, and there's more onus on those residents to protect themselves, and they often have less financial capability to do their own testing and protect themselves. So some unfortunate examples of like this, parts of Kent County have been exposed. Many are on private wells. Areas around Oscoda, where we have some of the most impoverished parts of Michigan, were exposed to PFAS contamination from the Air Force Base nearby. So it is a theme that we see, and it does require us to think about how we can protect those vulnerable communities that we typically see in really rural areas or really urban areas where there is a lot of exposure and less capacity to deal with those consequences.
So then speak to the role of industry regulation and their own personal checks and whatnot to prevent PFAS contamination, as well as the role of the government in overseeing how these companies, these different industries affect PFAS contamination and ultimately holding them accountable for protecting communities.
Yeah, so we absolutely need ethical companies to reduce or eliminate their use of PFAS entirely. In the majority of cases, PFAS are not an essential part of the supply chain, and they could be eliminated. So we need ethical use and ethical standards internally from companies. I was happy to see that 3M announced that they are ending production of PFAS. They have been a major supplier, and they've continued to be a major obstruction to good PFAS protections across the state and across the country. So I take what they're saying with a grain of salt, but I am happy that they are at least moving to ban PFAS. I would like to see automakers eliminate PFAS from their supply chain, not only in their own use, but in the places that they're getting car parts from. A typical use is the chrome plating that you find on cars. So all the plastic bits that are shiny. There was probably PFAS used in the production of those. So a lot of these sort of frivolous things that we could get rid of and avoid the use of PFAS, that there are ways to do that. And the companies responsible for making all those pieces are going to be the best suited to figure out how we can reduce PFAS use. So we absolutely need full engagement from industry to reduce PFAS use. That being said, we know that in many cases, like in the case of Tri-Bar in the Huron River watershed, we cannot necessarily trust those companies to act in good faith for their neighbors. So we need really strong regulations from local, state, federal government. At the state level, what we're really focused on right now is what we call polluter pay laws. Michigan had what we call polluter pay laws in the past, and over 30 years, those protections have been eroded. And we need to essentially reinstate those laws so that we can make polluters clean up their mess and also deter bad acts of pollution in the future. And at the federal level, thinking longer term and a bigger picture, we really need to ban the use of PFAS in non-essential uses going forward. PFAS bioaccumulate, they last forever. The problem isn't going away the longer that we continue to use these chemicals. They're just going to build up in the environment and poison us to a greater and greater degree until we eliminate their use. So long term, we have to think about ending our use and dependence on PFAS.
Well, Dan, we appreciate you joining us and telling us more about this issue and giving us some insight on steps we can take as communities and things we need to be keeping in consideration in terms of how our local governments and our state and federal government are addressing PFAS as well. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks so much.